Hi, Nick.
Hi, Ben.
Today, on this episode, we talked about the difference between cremation and burial.
Absolutely, we did. The
Yeah.
questions, the question mark, where to go, what to look for, what to see.
You know what I wished? People would subscribe.
You should subscribe.
You
Anybody
should
listening?
subscribe to our thing. So we're going to talk about burial and cremation on this episode.
Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about grief and mourning. Is it argumental or existential? What's it mean to me? Let's talk about death.
Hi, I'm Benny Cabal, and I'm a funeral professional.
And I'm Nicholas Cabal, psychologist.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about death.
So today we have an interesting topic. We have burials versus cremations. How do you feel about that?
There's a lot to talk about with that. I think, but most importantly, I think it's really important for the funeral director to talk about this because I think that a lot of people are not educated properly in what even you're talking about with burial versus cremation.
Okay, Nick, I'll take that one. A burial is a body in the ground, in a casket, usually in Michigan. Yet again, we're talking about different states, different rules, how they have their cemeteries, etc. In the state of Michigan, it is not required to have a vault, but all cemeteries around here have their own rule that they have to have a vault. So, Nick,
There's not one cemetery you've come across that don't require that?
Yes, there are. And we'll talk about that later. But my thing is, do you know what a vault is, Nick?
I do, but I don't know if our viewers know what a vault is.
So a vault is a box that the casket goes into in the cemetery.
It's kind of like the wrapping paper of a present.
It surely is. You know what, Nick? You nailed that. You nailed it.
It's just a lot stronger
Well,
and
that's
usually made of
and
concrete instead of paper.
Dan and I always
Would you
say
stop
this-
cutting me off, silly Willie?
Sorry.
Continue.
Dan and I always try to tell this to like children because they need to understand why is there a vault? Why is there a box? Why is there a box at the cemetery that you go to, right? And the idea is this. On Christmas, which I know some of our listeners are not Christian, so I apologize if you don't fall into this group. But let's be
Hanukkah.
honest. At Christmas, what happens? When you get a present, Nick,
Well, we are celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ for the Christians. That's what happens
yeah,
on
so let's
Christmas.
Let's pretend, Nick.
And then
that
there's this
you're-
guy named Santa Claus. It's a reference to St. Nicholas, who is the patron saint of children.
Okay, keep going. Keep going with that.
You just asked me what Christmas
okay.
was.
So, Nick, what do you get your gifts in?
Usually I get them in a burlap sack.
In a box?
No, just a sack. No, I'm just
Okay.
kidding. I get them in a present.
Yes, you get them in a box, right? Just
Sometimes
wrapped.
it's triangle,
And
rectangle.
the nicer the box, the nicer the...
The gift.
Yeah, so that's the idea, is your family member is a gift to the world. So, why we have a box is to protect, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea. Like in Christmas, like you have a box to protect your present before you open it.
Right. Let's move on to what's the difference between cremation and
So the difference
burial.
between cremation and burial, a burial is you legitimately putting a body in the ground, right?
Couldn't it be in a catacomb or anything like that too? In the wall?
Okay, so we could go a little further. So you could do what they call a entombment,
Mm-hmm.
which would be you put a body in the wall.
Mhm.
But we can also talk about cremation. Cremation is the idea that the body is going to get burnt.
Mm-hmm.
And so the difference would be, are you putting the body in the, you're right, in the wall? Or are you putting it in the ground? Or are you putting it, you're burning it
Okay.
and putting it then in an urn, or what they call a entombment for cremation is called a niche,
Mm-hmm.
which is really cool. So you can actually still put, like, let's say you have an urn, you could put the cremations in the urn and you could put it in the wall.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So, I watched a lot of movies. I want to ask you, in the state of Michigan, or what your experience is, can someone go watch their loved one get cremated?
Yes. Every cremation I know of has the ability where you can actually sit in. And I know there's some religions where the oldest son has to actually like push the button. So yes, every crematory I know of has the ability and have a room where you can literally sit and watch the cremation occur. Now realize the cremation is about a 2 to 4 to 6 hour situation. Is that something you want to watch? Now you're not going to watch it in a like it's not going to be a window door where you're going to see the person. It's going to be one of those things where you shut the door and then it happens, then it occurs.
Okay.
So yes, you can watch it. You can be a present for it. What I find most of my families, yet again, my personal opinion, most of my families don't want to be a part of that because it's a long process, hard process to watch.
Have you ever watched one?
I have watched one. I had to do it in school,
Mm-hmm.
so I did watch one. It's interesting, and that's the best I can say about that.
Why do you think people choose cremation?
I think people choose cremation for many other ways. I think one of the big ways is they think it's less expensive, right? They think
Okay.
it's less monetarily stress on their family.
Okay.
So what I'm finding with people who talk to me about death is they say, I want to do cremation because I want to spend less for my family, right?
Okay.
But what I find interesting about that situation is they actually sometimes spend more or the same because they spend it on other things. So we're talking jewelry, or we're talking thummies, which is like you take the person's thumbprint,
The deceased person,
and you put it on a metal or gold, silver, et
Trinkets.
cetera. There's also other things that you can do. You could take their picture and you can put it on an urn, or you can put it on blah, blah, blah. So what's interesting that I find about people who come in and say, I want my family not to spend the money on my funeral.
Okay.
Right. And so they'll come in and then they'll spend enormous amounts on everything else. Like, I want to make sure that I have an urn that has
Papa's face on it.
Papa's face on it and all this, and they're going to take it there and they're going to do that. It's not funny because that's a horrible term. It's interesting because it ends up being about the same monetary as if they would have done.
But I guess
The
at
traditional
the end of the day, they get to take something with them.
Right. And the problem that I have with cremation, because we got to talk about cremation, because that's the biggest problem. The biggest problem that I have with cremation is not cremation itself. Cremation is amazing. It's another way of taking care of your loved one.
Well, it's a very traditional way in some aspects.
What I
too.
have a problem with cremation is direct.
Right.
So you're not going to a funeral, to a visitation, to an actual thing where you can say your goodbyes, right? So that's the problem that I have is I think a lot of people personally, like themselves, say it's just easier, right? You hear this all the time, Nick. It's easier that people don't have to grieve for me, right? And that's the worst comment you can ever make.
They don't want people to put up a fuss.
Because it doesn't matter what you feel.
Right. The funeral's not.
I'm grieving for you. You're not
Right.
grieving for yourself.
Well, you're gone at that point. The funeral is not for the person that actually died. It's for the family members and survivors. To grieve.
Right. So it's interesting because they'll always make the comment like, just throw me in a box in the backyard.
Right. And I get that. I get
hear
that. I get that
and-
mentality. You know, they don't want people to put up a fuss with them.
But they don't realize it's not even the kids. Most likely it's not the kids.
I think it's for everybody.
No, I understand that. But most likely the kids know that because dad said this is how I want to do things, blah, blah, blah. So they're okay with it.
Okay.
They may not like it, but they're okay with it.
They're going to respect his wishes.
It's the grandkids.
Mhm.
Or it's the friend next door. I never had a chance to go in and tell my story.
So I think what Ben's trying to say is that through psychology, through funeral directing, the experience, most would agree that because immediate cremation doesn't allow space and time for the family to grieve, then there's this lasting bereavement that seems to happen because there's no closure.
Right. And I'm not going to say every family has that problem.
No. But we're saying what we see we're generalizing here. What
Right,
we see
right.
in studies and what we see,
There's always
funeral directors' experiences.
somebody who gets left out.
Why do you always have to cut me off?
Sorry. So another thought that maybe some people have is, can you have a cremation but still have like a viewing and like all that. You can. And in fact, they make cremation caskets.
Isn't that called
specifically.
something different?
So they have rentals. They
No.
have what
I'm
they-
saying the ceremony itself.
memorial.
No.
That would be the difference. So a funeral is when you're actually being shown.
Right.
A memorial would be if we brought your urn in, Nick.
Right.
So, like, here's the difference. So Nick has a visitation / funeral. He would be present at that. So Nick's body would be present
The
at
deceased
both.
body is present.
Correct. A memorial service is when you're not present. So that would be
Instead of the body being present, the
correct.
ashes or
The
no
ashes
ashes.
or no ashes at all. Correct.
Maybe a picture or something. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Nick.
You're welcome. I just think a lot of people don't understand the difference between
No,
those
no,
two.
and it's such a everybody wants to know that, and nobody knows that. So I appreciate you asking that
Yeah.
question.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, there's a difference between a funeral and a memorial service,
Yes.
and that's why. Well, and I think there's also an important thing to talk about when we talk about cremation and burial, at least from my dissertation standpoint. What I've learned is that traditions have changed. So traditionally in the United States for the last, 100-something years, it's been visitation and then burial. That's the traditional way. However, as time is passed and how we grieve has changed, meaning that people do not have the time nor the ability to grieve as long as we used to. For example, there used to be 2 days visitation and then a funeral. Jobs didn't give you such a hard time if you were going to miss work to
Right.
go to a funeral. Now they do. Not quite sure exactly why that is. I think it's just the change of how we view death. I mean, it's more like we want to push it away as quickly as possible. Grief is not something that goes away. It's something that you live with. It's something that you explore, and there's no timetable on it. So the comment, if you ever have heard someone, be like, "Oh, get over it," or "Why are you still grieving?" or "That happened 2 years ago."
It's a worse disenfranchised, right?
Well, disenfranchised grief, but more importantly, it's a very unhuman way of approaching death, because empathy, I think, is the best way we can approach bereavement, to bypass guilt, shame, everything that's associated with losing someone that you love. And I think a lot of people get lost in this idea that there's, Kubler-Ross wrote the 5 stages, and why are you still
Acceptance.
in,
Why are you still in denial? Or
and the saddest
bargaining.
part is that she didn't write that before that. She actually wrote it on the person that was actually dying. More importantly, it's just a rough draft of what the grieving process looks like, and it doesn't happen in an order. So I think one thing I would like to stress to all you viewers out there is that there is no timetable on grief, especially if it's someone that you were super close to. It's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt for a really long time. And it's okay to hurt that long, and it's okay for others to hurt that long. And maybe you don't feel that way, and that's okay. Maybe you do take a week or a day, and that's all you need. But there's a lot of people out there that's not enough.
Well, Nick, and I'm going to say something, and I know this will probably strike some feathers with some of my colleagues.
What does strike some feathers mean?
Strike feathers. So you pull feathers off a
Pulling
turkey.
feathers.
Turkey.
Like strike, like are
Thank
we
you, Nick.
bowling?
All right, so here's my thing. I think cremation or burial is there's 2 different great ways to take care of your loved one. That's not the struggle that I have. The struggle that I have is just make sure that everybody has what they need to get through that.
Who's
Just
given
give
the
an
opportunity, though?
Give somebody who's on the outskirts of the family, whether it's a grandkid or it's a friend or it's a neighbor, an opportunity to be able to say goodbye. Right?
Okay.
Because some people need to see a body. Some people don't. Some people don't. Some people don't want to see the body. Some people always come up to me and they'll say, "I want to remember Frank the way I remembered Frank."
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And then other people are like, "Well, I need to see him."
When you touch them, yep.
Well,
Well, and I think that's the important part, is what I think we already nailed with, is the important part of a memorial service. It doesn't have to have the urn. It doesn't
no.
have to.
You
just
you
a
could
place
still
for people to come
You could
and
still
grieve.
do the cremation. You don't even have to have the body present. Just the idea that you give an opportunity for people to grieve.
Okay.
Is that too much? Do you think that's too much for me to ask as
No.
a professional?
No. But I think you're going to hit a lot of roadblocks with that.
Well,
I think
yeah,
that
we'll hit the
if you try to
roadblocks
make everybody-
together, Nick.
I mean, we all know that if you try to make everybody happy, you're just going to be miserable.
Can you be my passenger seat co-pilot?
Co-pilot to what?
That.
Helping people realize the importance of grieving? Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. I think it is important to say that.
Do you want to hold hands?
But that doesn't necessarily. But it's kind of like that old saying. Some people will say, "I don't have to go to church to believe in God."
No. I see. I think I already said it.
So
Some people don't need that, but some people do. Nick.
absolutely, I think what
That's
what
the
you're
problem that
trying
I
to say
have.
is just take a moment to let that set in, because I think how our society works in rushing everything. I think a lot of people make split decisions.
Can it be
without-
brass? Can it be brass? Is it worth spending the extra money to protect somebody?
Did you say brass or crass?
Brass.
Okay.
Is it brass for me to spend the extra money to actually have a visitation that could possibly protect somebody?
If you have the capability to do that.
Yeah.
Sure. So an interesting point to this whole conversation is, let's say the deceased doesn't have family or it doesn't have financial means for any of this, for cremation or burial. So what happens then?
It's a tricky slope. Let's be honest.
It's a tricky slope.
It's a tricky slope because the idea is we're still a business, right? At the
Yep.
end of the day, right? So there is certain things that Dad and I, how do I put this where I make it sound professional, but at the same time it makes sense.
You
to
take a
you.
hit.
We take a hit.
Yep.
It's happened. It's not.
I think every
I think
business can
every
say they take hits.
firm that's a good firm has taken a hit one way or another.
Right. I guess I'm asking, is there state
There are things.
or
There is
like
the Cremation Society
okay.
that will help you take care of
Okay.
certain funds. So the real difference between cremation and burial, the easiest way to tell it is you're either burying a body, you're putting a body in a casket and possibly in a vault, or you're cremating, which is literally taking a body to a 4 to 6 hour process where they literally get burned
Into ashes.
into ashes. And the easiest way to tell this to children, and please take the time to watch the How to Talk to Children About Death episode that we did. But the easiest way to tell children, because they can't understand why Grandpa is in this urn, this box, because he was a big guy, he was 280 pounds, 300 pounds, whatever, is to say that, think about a campfire. And at the end of the campfire, what's left? And then they go, oh, well, it's just the ashes. And you're like, okay, that's what happened to Grandpa. Because kids are very black and white, and they understand that. Now, if they have more questions, they'll ask you, but some of them will be like, nope, that's good enough for me. I get that. So the difference between cremation and burial is that. Financially, burial and cremation are a little bit different. Usually, cremation tends to be a little less expensive, but that's not necessarily true depending on what you have. Because you could buy a very expensive, elaborate urn. I've heard this too, where families will do a trip where they take their loved one out to somewhere and disperse their ashes. Usually that tends to be cheaper or less expensive, but that's not necessarily true. And then burial is legitimately just taking your loved one, putting them in a casket, and then putting them in a vault. Because in the state of Michigan, the cemeteries have a obligation to have a vault, which is basically a box to put the casket in. So in the state of Michigan, you have a couple different issues. So let's say you're married, right? You're married, and your wife is Katie. We know that. Maybe we know that. Maybe we don't know that. If you pass away, she has 100% rights on whatever she wants to do with you.
Yep.
But let's say you and her both got into a ski accident because you were, going off
mountain skiing,
obviously, in
normal
your
weekend
class
thing
act
I do.
on it.
Yep.
And you both, it's not even your fault. Somebody hits you. And
Okay,
you guys,
let's go past that. Okay, so we both pass away.
So now it goes down to your children.
Mhm.
Okay, so your children are,
I have 2 children.
and they're less than 18. So never mind, it would go even further than that. So then they go to your parents. So then mom and dad would have the option for you, and her mom and dad would have the options for her.
I think we're making this a lot more confusing than it really needs to be.
No,
on
but
a
it
normal
is, Nick,
basis.
Nick, it is very confusing.
On a normal basis,
On a normal basis, this is how it works.
the spouse has first say.
So let's say we're talking about 70, 80-year-old people. Right. That would be the normal scenario.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't have their spouse,
Right.
it goes down to their children.
Yep.
If they don't have children, it goes to their parents. Obviously, at that point, parents are most likely
If there's
deceased.
multiple children,
You have to have a majority rule.
so if you had 2,
You would have to get both signatures.
Right.
You can't just have
if
one.
you had 3, you'd have to get 2.
2. Correct. Now, Michigan does have a funeral representative. That's what the title of the.
So you have to have someone that basically says this person wanted to be cremated.
Correct.
In
And they don't have any. They don't have any say with anything else. They just have control over what happens to the disposition. That's the actual legal term for you, Nick. Of you.
So it's like a power of attorney for funeral.
Just for your funeral.
Yeah.
So they can choose if they want you to be cremated. They can choose if they want you to be buried. et
Now,
cetera,
how
et
do
cetera.
you get a hold of this information? Like, do you
So-
have to go see a lawyer, or do you just go to a funeral director?
So the funeral director, every funeral director, this just got added within the last couple of years.
So you have the legal rights to basically say that this
Correct.
person. Do you have to get it like
So
notarized or anything like that?
Yeah, I would give you the paperwork.
Mhm.
You would have to get it notarized. I think you got to get it notarized by 2 different notaries.
Okay. Yeah.
You got to be saying to mind.
Can the funeral director be one of the notaries?
No,
Okay.
no,
Okay.
because that's a conflict of interest.
It makes sense.
Now we're gonna go into a little session I like to call.
Q&A. Gotta get me that Q&A.
Q&A, everyone loves that Q&A.
Question 1 here. Why do we spend so much on our dead?
Okay.
Recently, a friend of mine's sister died. They spent thousands for the coffin, ceremony, and tombstone. Why? If I were to die, I wouldn't mind being buried in just a pine box with a wood tombstone without ceremony. But I'm an atheist, like my parents. Maybe there is a religious component that I am not aware of. So why? Question mark.
Okay, so Nick, I'm gonna throw something at you. When you're 3 years old, Nick,
Mm-hmm.
this is the main thing that you think of. When you're like this big, like how
My future wedding.
wedding, and how much money are you gonna spend on a wedding?
Billions.
Exactly. The idea is this: you spent all this time as a kid finding that you want to spend all this money on your gown, this wedding day, right? That may happen. It may happen multiple times,
Sure.
and you're only going to die once.
Sure.
You're willing to do that 3 or 4 times as a marriage, but you're not willing to do that for your loved one.
Well, I think the important part about this question, though, is that this person doesn't.
They don't see it because they don't see it as them. They don't want to spend that money, right?
Well, they're saying that she's saying her sister spent this much money, and now she's saying, why would they do that when I wouldn't even spend this much money on myself?
Isn't that the idea? She's having the problem. Why would I spend that much money on my own funeral? Correct?
Yeah.
That's the idea. And it goes back to this. Your funeral is never about you. It really is never about you. It's about everybody else. Maybe to you, you don't understand that having a day for your granddaughter is going to save her life
Right.
in some way.
But it might.
It might not. It might not. Yes,
Right.
you might be spending $10,000 to do nothing, in your opinion. I get that.
Mm.
But the idea is maybe your grandkid needed that.
I
Am
got you.
right?
Let's move on to the next question. This one is regrets after viewing. Where I am from, open casket funerals are taboo. Even private viewings at a funeral home are rare. I wonder where this person comes from. Some people might visit the deceased hospital bed before he or she is whisked away to a cold room, but it's not the norm. When my parents pass, I think I might like to see them, but I am apprehensive. I know that many people regret not seeing a dead loved one, but has anybody regretted seeing them?
Yeah. You know what? I have heard that. And I've had people, grown men, grown women, stay outside the funeral home. And I will come up and be like, do you want to go in? And, your wife just went in, or, the weather's bad outside. And they'll look at me like, no, I'm good. I'm staying right here. And I'll ask them, and it's always about a negative experience they've had at a funeral home. And I think we talked about this, Nick, with children.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them make this experience of what a funeral home is, what seeing or not seeing a deceased is to them, at an early age. And I think a lot of them have had very bad experiences. I've heard a lot of were saying, well, grandma was sleeping, and I knew grandma wasn't sleeping, so that was a problem. Or I was forced to see dad.
I think we're losing what this actual question is
Oh, I'm
asking,
sorry.
though.
Sorry, Nick.
She's asking, has anybody actually regretted
Seeing
seeing
them. That's what I'm telling you.
Right.
Seeing them because they were forced to see them.
Okay.
So the idea of what I'm saying to you is some people are okay with the idea of I want to be here, I want to be present, I want to be in the funeral home with my mom, with my dad,
Right.
whatever. I don't want to be forced to go up to that casket.
Because if you force them,
Right. Because the idea is children, I find, and this could be very seen in
your
both
experience,
ways, are very black and white. They're going to tell you, I want to go up and see that body. I don't want to go see the body.
right?
I want to be there. I do think that as a parent, I think it's very essential to have them come to a funeral. But I do think you let them do whatever they want to do when they get there.
So you're saying to force them
I'm
to
not
come.
I'm not saying force them to come. I'm saying get them to the funeral because come on, Nick, work parents. Get the kids here.
Okay.
They're going to play with the cousins in the back if they don't want to have anything to do.
Okay.
But the idea is they can't say you didn't let me go to
Right.
grandma's funeral.
Why?
You didn't let me go to Aunt Thelma's
Right.
funeral.
I don't know why you're winking at me.
Seeing this question now is the idea of is it okay to see or
Has
would
anybody
they
regretted
seeing their deathbed?
seeing someone on their deathbed?
I can say this from a personal experience, Nick, that I've learned so much more about life and death because I got to see Papa die.
Yeah.
I got to see him take his last breath. I got to see Nana say, it's okay,
Right.
go home. I'm not saying everybody has the same experience because I've seen 1,000 experiences when it comes to that. But the idea is I got to see somebody that I loved take his last breath. Do I think it's important? I absolutely do.
However, I do think it is also important to note that some people want to remember the loved one in a brighter light than to watch them, the death rattle and all that stuff, it's a very emotional, sometimes scary.
Can I flip that on you, Nick, though?
Hold on, experience for some people. Actually, traumatic experience for some people.
Can I
Has people regretted seeing their loved one on their deathbed? Probably. Just because it depends on the relationship. It depends on, what is their experience with this person? What is their experience around funerals or death? If that's the first death in their family and they're watching someone that they truly love go through, painful, not being able to breathe, all that stuff, it may be completely traumatic to see that. And that might be something that interferes with them being able to see Papa or Dad in an easier way, because that in the back of their mind they can always hear the death rattle, or they can always smell what that deathbed smelled like. Especially with smell, we all know that psychologically we remember things quite easily through smell because it's the only one that actually bypasses a lot of the barriers. It just goes straight into your memory. That's why people get sick when they smell certain things.
Can I go further, though, and say you could look at the opposite way, Nick, too, though, that some people need that experience.
And some people might regret not being there.
However, that's where we're at.
However, I think she's asking, can somebody regret that?
Yes.
I think the answer to that question is yes. However, what I'd like to ask this person is, what do you feel about this? Is this something that you think is important to you? Then absolutely go. If you don't think it's that important and you don't want to remember that person in that light, don't go.
Feel free to email us. Let's talk about death pod@gmail.com.
Yeah.
And feel free to say if your experience is. And maybe you had one that you didn't like, or maybe you had an experience that I wish, everybody would realize that it's important time to be. In my personal experience, I wouldn't give it up for the world to watch my grandfather take his last breaths. But I was also almost 30 years old. You know what I mean? It wasn't like I was 12.
When you're also a funeral director, you have
and I'm a
experience
funeral
around.
director and really cool surfer, really good surfer.
No, that's definitely not accurate nor true.
Feel free to let us know your thoughts.
Well, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening. Listen on, because if you're not talking about death,
He ain't living.
you ain't living.